Continuing on with David Hume, that if our morality is based in how we feel, which it very well might, especially for Hume, then how does that then kind of translate to the way that we live our daily lives? Because that's a fair question. And moreover, I mean, it would make sense that if I were to say, all right, well, I feel this particular way about this particular thing, okay, and ultimately, you know, that might not stay consistent throughout my entire life, because I may experience something, that's very Humean language, I may experience something that causes me to change my mind, right? And so how we account for kind of change with regards to our moral beliefs and how it is we understand the rightness, wrongness, goodness, badness of actions and of situations, yeah, it can very much be in flux because we are experiential beings and our experience in the world changes all of the time. So again, the skepticism for any sort of objective truth, objective knowledge on moral propositions, moral situations is non-existent for Hume. Okay? And this is a really fascinating and I think provocative claim. Because I think a lot of us would like to believe, like, yeah, I'm right. What I believe, I'm right. Otherwise, I wouldn't believe it. Whether that be about abortion, about gay marriage, about climate change, right? About all of these hot button issues, right? We probably all claim that we are right. Otherwise, we wouldn't believe what it is we believe. But from the Humean perspective, ultimately all that is referential to how it is we feel. He might be right. Now, with that as the proposition, for Hume, he still kind of gives us a nice guide, he still gives us a nice signpost, if you will, on how it is one can live. That even if we're left in this kind of moral skepticism, which we are for Hume, we can still have propositions and understanding of what is right, wrong, good, and bad. And it can be on the matter of feeling. Now for Hume, he's going to claim this as, and he claims this somewhere outside the scope of the excerpt, but he claims this as what he calls our moral sense. That he thinks that as human beings, as experiential beings, we all have a moral sense. And that moral sense, most easily understood for Hume, is our ability to empathize. Empathize or sympathize, depending on the context. Essentially, we know what it's like to be in another person's shoes. That we have a fairly reasonable good gauge at understanding how people feel. And this is a really interesting thing that Hume does here. This whole while, he's kind of boiling us down, boiling his theory down to this subjectivism, right? Which is undeniable. That's certainly true. But nevertheless, what he does now and where he takes his stance is this idea that, yeah, sure, we're not going to ever have any sort of objective moral truth, objective moral conclusions, because ultimately it is based in impressions, how we feel, etc. But we have this very powerful sense of knowing how others feel. Right? That if I walk outside right now and I'm walking down the street and I see an adult smack a child, I'm going to have an immediate reaction. And again, I'm pointing to my gut here, but I'm going to have an immediate reaction because I can see that child was just slapped and perhaps that child now is crying. Right? And I don't need to do much investigation to know how that child feels. That child is in pain, that child is in agony, right? And I feel for that child. Right? Again, I'm pointing to my gut here. Moreover, I can see maybe the parent or the adult walk away kind of very, stern, very, very flush, very kind of like angry, right? And I can reasonably understand how that adult perhaps feels. Maybe I don't agree with it. right? But nevertheless, I can recognize how that adult probably feels. Okay? And so what we have here, right, is this ethical theory that produces this recognition of empathy and sympathy. And so those actions then for Hume that he says we ought to pursue are those actions which produce goodness, happiness, joy. Those actions which we ought to stay away from are those actions that cause pain, unhappiness, non-joy. Pretty simple, right? And think about it. Think about it here. This idea that happiness, joy, pleasure, those are all feelings. Unhappiness, pain, non-joy, all feelings. So those actions which we ought to pursue, those actions which we ought to seek out, based off of our moral sense of knowing how it is others feel, right, are those actions that cause joy, happiness, pleasure. Those actions which we ought to stay away from include unhappiness, non-joy, pain. Because ultimately, we have experienced, again, focusing on that word, we have experienced pain. We have experienced non-happiness, unjoy. And it doesn't feel good. So why would we try to contribute that outwardly into the world? So, a couple of things here. One, first and foremost, all of our knowledge is derived from experience for Hume, and that includes our moral knowledge. And in particular, as subjective individuals in a very ever-changing world, we have a very subjective approach on morality. Right? Because ultimately, everything is based in the impressions which lead to a formation of the ideas, lead to the formation of our reflective ideas. And that fundamentally, when we think about our impressions, it's a basis on how we feel, that we have these immediate impressions that then influence our ideas about the world. And from that, we also have this ability to not agree. Because objective moral truths can never be known for Hume, right? Because it's all based on feeling, then with all these hot button issues, we kind of talk past one another. And we see that all the time, right? We see that all the time, especially right now in a political season. But nevertheless, in our daily lives and in our understanding of how it is perhaps we ought to treat one another, we can recognize how others feel. And sure, we get it wrong from time to time, but reasonably, given our moral sense, our moral calibration to be able to understand how others feel, we can know how it is we ought to act. And we ought to do those things that cause good feelings, cause joy, happiness, pleasure. We ought to stay away from those things that cause unhappiness, pain, displeasure. And that is Hume in about a 35-minute nutshell. So, the last thing that I'll leave you with here, just with kind of Humean thought, because I think that, again, there's some really rich insights here, is if we think about, and this is again kind of just outside the purview of ethics here, but think about advertising for a second. I think advertisers and marketers, and this isn't a slight by any means, so if you are studying advertising or marketing, I don't mean it as a slight at all, I just think it's a fascinating thing to consider here, is that marketers and advertisers, they utilize this insight that Hume had, back hundreds and hundreds of years ago, that essentially advertisers, what they try to do, right, is they try to excite an immediate emotion, an immediate feeling, an immediate passion, without you really thinking, and then ultimately from that, right, you form an idea that I need to go out and buy this product. And when you think about it in terms of sex, right, sex sells, right? We see this commercial of perhaps, some really scantily clad males or females, and they're doing this particular thing, right? All of that, which is to kind of disarm one, right? To disarm kind of our mental engagement, just be like, oh my gosh, I need that product, right? Well, where did that come from? That desire came from the immediate impression that you had of witnessing that and then forming the idea. Or perhaps, those sentimental commercials about beer, right? I think there was a pretty popular one um, a year ago or so with this guy and his puppy dog, and I mean, yeah, and right, it was a cause for emotion. And I think probably again back to the animals, one that um, is wildly emotional, right? Are the Humane Society commercials, right? You're sitting there watching TV, and all of a sudden, like Sarah McLachlan comes on this very sad song to make you feel a particular way. And you see all these really sad pictures of these animals, right, that have been abused, neglected. All of that, unless you don't have a heart, right, you feel a particular way. Right? It's marketed in such a way to exploit your emotions, to make you feel a particular way that then there informs and creates an impression, or pardon me, creates an idea that you should support that organization. And so advertisers are using Humean insight, using Humean thought as a focus on our emotions, on a focus of our impact in the world as emotional creatures. And to separate emotion from who it is we are is very, very difficult. And what we'll encounter in a couple of days with Immanuel Kant is a very different philosophy. That Hume so focused on the emotions, where Kant is going to focus on reason and rationality. And I think that the distinction between the two is pretty great and pretty challenging on how it is we understand what is moral and how to understand morality.